is the next softest pastime. This is a famous painting depicting Canadian field artillery engineers. So you can see it's a pretty rough job. To say it was enjoyable is you can detect the sarcasm. And then the double sarcasm with engineering being the next softest pastime, which is pretty hilarious. So why study the intersection of nationalism and militarism in Canadian engineering activities? Well, the intersection of nationalism and militarism was present in Canadian engineering education during its foundational period prior to the First World War. And more importantly, because this period of Canadian engineering education and the intersection of nationalism and militarism remains unexplored and under-acknowledged, it's harder to acknowledge it and detect it today in today's Canadian engineering activities, right? So just for a brief example, I'll show you how the history of the engineering education in the United States prior to the US Civil War kind of influences engineering activity, nationalism and militarism in engineering activities today in America. So the first college to offer engineering instruction and degrees was actually the United States Military Academy at West Point. As you can tell by the name, it's a national institution and it's a military institution. What's interesting is cadets at this time, you didn't have to be a soldier when you graduated. So a lot of them formed the first professional class of civil engineers. They built a lot of the roads, bridges, and tunnels. But when the Civil War breaks out in the 1860s, because they have this military training in their back pocket, they all pick up guns. And to paraphrase the words of a former president, you had very fine graduates on both sides of the conflict. Famously, the Confederate States of America, the slave owners, the president and vice president of that country were West Point graduates. So what does that mean for engineering today in terms of militarism, nationalism, and the activities? Well, West Point, along with United States Service Academies at servicing the US Air Force, Coast Guard, and Navy, remain among the top undergraduate engineering colleges in the US. So the activities they do at those schools reinforce this national militarism, obviously because they're national military academies. And what's interesting is to be an astronaut with NASA, you basically need to be an engineer. Vast majority of astronauts have engineering degrees. But if you really want to be an astronaut, astronauts are not a military field we usually associate with, military. So we think of science being for the benefit of humanity. Overwhelming majority went to US military academies, more than any other schools combined. This is a picture of Lieutenant Caleb Barron, 33 years old, just got accepted to the latest cohort of NASA engineers. She's a submarine officer. She went to the Naval Academy. And why does this matter? Well, under the last US administration, we had the creation of the 6th branch of the United States Armed Forces, the United States Space Force. So we're seeing the militarization of space, which we can kind of connect to so many astronauts being military officers itself. So this is kind of a natural progression or endpoint. So what about Canadian engineering education? Is the same intersection of nationalism and militarism present within Canadian that was present within Canadian engineering education prior to our seminal conflict, the First World War, still evident today? Well, let's step back a bit and define our terms. So nationalism. Nationalism is about taking pride, prioritizing one's nation or group, seeing them as distinct, and fighting on behalf to preserve or promote that group, right? When we talk about the rise of nationalism in Europe, for instance, this is what we tend to talk about. Militarism, on the other hand, is the privileging of the military and military ideas. So it's a belief maybe spending more on the military, believing military solutions are the best solutions to resolving global conflict, and also praising military ideals. So ideals that the military prizes, obedience, hierarchy, they have a rank structure, and things like competition, which we'll talk about later. So prior to the First World War, engineering education activities really enforced nationalism and militarism through engineering society meetings where you'd have speakers come in and talk to students. They would be former generals who became engineering magnates, and industry leaders who would say, you guys build the country. Okay, you guys build the country. You're responsible for building the country. We need you guys to build the country, and also we need you to undertake military training. And this resulted in the creation of engineering corps on these campuses. So engineering corps are basically cadet military engineering programs that offered engineering students military training to complement their civil engineering training. So here they also got inundated with nationalism and militaristic aims. This is a picture of the 5th Field Company at Queen's University. It was created in 1910. And obviously we know 4 years later, the First World War broke out. They went on to use their training to go build trenches in France. Just to further highlight this point, At some of these engineering society meetings, you had like Lieutenant Colonel R.W. Leonard, former Royal Military College graduate, Vice President of Society of Civil Engineers, and he tells the engineering students at U of T that military training is as important as training in mathematics, and we should not allow sports and music to interfere. So he's linking military training to your engineering education. The Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, same academic year, goes to Queens and tells the students there, you engineers, more than any other body of educated men in the country, have more to do in the application of knowledge, initiating and carrying out projects for our bettering of our country. I know of no profession so important at the present time as the one to which you belong. So again, these engineers are getting hyped up. You guys are the builders of the country. We're going to see this theme reoccur even today in Canadian engineering. So how did I theorize of engineering education? First of all, I had to theorize it as it's a professional program, right? Like doctors, nurses, teachers, you go through an apprenticeship program in your education, then you become a professional. So professional socialization refers to the process of learning the values and ideals that you're going to need to succeed in your profession. One way this is done is through the hegemonic or hidden curriculum. We have an image of an iceberg. If we view the formal curriculum as the top visible part, quantifiable part of the iceberg, the hegemonic or hidden curriculum we can view as the part that's hidden underwater, right? The informal. And part of this informal education where these values and ideals of the engineering profession are learned are through non-cone extracurricular activities. These are activities that occur outside of the classroom, outside of the formal academic space, but involve engineering students that may or may not be related to engineering. So as I said, prior to the First World War, those activities were engineering society meetings where the ideas of nationalism and militarism were talked about by guest speakers, and through the engineering corps where they received military training that further indoctrinated them with these ideals. A great quote referring to this process is by the Dean of Mining from Queen's University in 1909. He referred to three phases of the engineering profession: students, apprenticeship, and then basically professionals. And he said a great many factors tend to make college life what it is. One of the most important of these is the social and university life. You learn from each other, from the surroundings, and from the operating of college organizations. So again, how important extracurricular, co and non-curricular activities are to the professional socialization of students. So in order to get the data for how militarism and nationalism are present within engineering education activities today, I use a content analysis approach using contemporary documents and quantitatively take data. Being COVID, it was hard to go and conduct interviews, but because I'd used this method to look at the historical element, I thought it was nice to also look at the contemporary element. This is a logo of the Queen's Journal newspaper. Queen's Journal was published 100 years ago, so it's interesting to compare and contrast the newspaper covering engineering education activities in the past and in the present. So again, I use student, alumni, faculty, and administrative published materials, alumni newsletters, student newspapers, etc. 3 Ontario-based English language institutions between 2010 and 2019. Queen's, the Royal Military College, and U of T, because these are programs that had engineering programs before the First World War and today. And I looked at non-code extracurricular activities involving engineering students, describing nationalistic and militaristic values. So what did I find? So basically there's 2 main engineering activities that reinforce nationalist and militaristic narratives within engineering education. We have basically speaker series. So these are clubs within engineering, whether it's the engineering societies, which existed a long time ago, or different things about encouraging women to become engineers, or different groups, and bringing in speakers who promote more so nationalist values, right? This idea, remember I referred to in 1910, that the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario said, you guys build the country, you guys are responsible for building the country. This kind of rhetoric is still present today through these speaker series, which I'll get into. And we have engineering clubs and competitions. So this is more focusing, this is more how militarism thrives within engineering education activities today, which I'll get into. Clubs and competitions, obviously self-explanatory, engineering clubs and engineering clubs, so I'll get into that. So the big rock stars on campus are astronauts. Engineering societies love to boast of Chris Hadfield going to RMC, Julie Payette being a U of T grad. So they love to bring astronauts to come and talk to their students. Space is a really big interest area for engineering faculties and departments. I like this quote from an RMC cadet who said, seeing a Chris Hadfield or Mark Renault, who had attended RMC, walking around the peninsula can certainly help any RMC cadet picture themselves in an exceptional future. So they bring these astronauts to talk to students about what future they can picture for themselves. Again, like their US counterparts, Royal Military College graduates account for over 1/3 of all the astronauts ever sent to space. So it's again, this idea that you have to kind of have military background, as well as engineering, the marrying of those two means you can go and explore space. An interesting quote for UFT was a lot of the administrators in 2017 said the engineers who built everything are retiring. Canada needs highly qualified graduates to replace them. So again, we're seeing this. The engineers are the people who build Canada. And I know a lot of people have trouble with that. You know, social activists build Canada, politicians, lawyers. But again, this theme of engineers building Canada is one that was evident over 100 years ago and surprisingly still evident today. So the other avenue apart from speakers was the clubs. This is a picture of the University of Toronto Aerospace team. You can see they're working on a drone. A lot of these clubs are involved in robot combat, autonomous vehicle creation, cyber defense, security, and rocketry. What's interesting is none of these activities are ever explicitly tied to militaristic aims. Just an analog for that was I mentioned Queens's engineering cadet program back in the 1910s. Even though it started in 1910 as a military engineering organization, in 1907, it was started by the engineering professor at Queen's as a civil engineering survey camp. So he takes students, they'd go build bridges, sing songs, but then 3 years later, he turned it into an explicitly military organization. 4 years later, they're fighting over in France and digging trenches, right? And so whereas those military engineering corps train the engineering students of yesteryear to prepare for an eventual conflict on the battlefield, the muddy fields of Flanders in France and Belgium. Today, we have students working in robot combat, autonomous vehicle creation, cyber defense, security, and rocketry. But the battlefield is also shifting from, battlefields, literal fields, to cyberspace and space. So if we're not having a discussion about how historically, benign camping by a lake turned into military training, turned into students fighting on the battlefields of France. We're also not having a conversation about students innocently working in cyber defense and security or building rockets or building drones can turn into them being used as the future soldiers in cyberspace warfare, which is why it's really important to understand that history. Also competition. For other people, you want to compete, you join an intramural team, you join a varsity sports team. Engineers have so many competitions. All their clubs basically go, they're not just clubs, they go and compete. This is a picture of Queen's hackathon competition where students are hacking databases. Again, could be a precursor for future cyber warfare soldiers. And it really reminded me of a quote I came across from 1883, so 30 years before the First World War, where the RMC commandant, who was a general, said, "As a soldier, my experience in Canada is that properly regulated competition results in the best students all around coming to the front. It is proved by such tests as are here advocated that a country needs and upon whom she will have to rely when her time of trial arrives." So he knew that competition among engineering students, because back in the day, all RMC students were engineers, that fostering competition among engineering students would help them serve their nation and the military when their time arrived. Obviously, the First World War happens 30 years later. So why study this history and why link it to today and why is it important? The dean of Queen's University during the centenary of the First World War said, many members who fought in France started their military careers when they're Queens as students. I look around at my students today, young men and women, and know the only thing separating them is time, right? So this troubling element that innocent engineering students 100 years ago eventually went to die on the battlefields of France and were prepped and started their military careers at Queen's. We may be seeing a similar situation where students working on drones and in cybersecurity are starting their military careers at Queen's or UFT or RMC, but because we're not aware that the future, we're not having a discussion about the future battlefields being in cyber and space, we're not talking about the implications. So again, those same values and ideals of nationalism, militarism from the foundation period of Canadian engineering education are still reoccurring today. And because we're not aware of where we've been, we are having a hard time of acknowledging what we could be working towards. Thanks. I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much, Atta, for your presentation and the great information you provided us with. Now this is the question period. So if any of our attendees would like to ask any question or comment, that's your turn now. Floor is yours. We have a question from Aridan. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for this. I learned so much in 15 minutes, so thank you.
Thank you.
And I have a million questions, but do you think there's ever a possibility of moving away from the militarization, or this is just so threaded into this field that this is the way it's always going to be?
I think, and as I mentioned, I think because it's been under acknowledged, right? Like it's like because I'm not, first full disclosure, I'm not an engineering student, okay? Like I'm not a STEM student. So coming in from like a humanities background, not an objective, but like an outsider's view, these discussions aren't even being discussed because I don't think within engineering departments, there's the same consciousness as you would see in an education faculty, where we're constantly grappling with the values that undermine our academic discipline. Because this has never been really engaged with in engineering, they're not having these kind of discussions. And so, as I mentioned, as warfare shifts towards cyber, and we're using autonomous vehicles and drones and such, and students are learning these skills, there's no discussion of, hey, wait, could these students be used to be the future soldiers, use these for militaristic aims? Because there's no discussion within engineering about the underpinning values of the discipline. I don't want to say no, but especially in the United States, I think there's more of a discourse, but in Canada, it's surprisingly quiet, which I think is a bit concerning.
And as a follow-up question, I do appreciate that you are not the wizard of all things engineering, but do you think it would be also of value to look where the funding is coming from?
Yeah, what's interesting is I think I came across an academic article from 2011. I can't remember her first name, but it's by, I think it's like Laura Beach. And she talked about the relationship between the Canadian military industrial complex and research funding towards STEM programs in Canada. But again, that's only one article, right? No one is really looking at this relationship within Canadian engineering and the Canadian military industrial complex. I came across a Department of Defense National Defense statistic that said 30% of the jobs in defense-related industries go to STEM graduates, but that's not broken down by what elements of STEM. And again, in the United States, there's a lot of research between the Pentagon and funding and all these things. And in Canada, there's almost nothing. So I think, like a lot of things in Canada, because we're not as rigorous in kind of looking underneath rocks. People are allowed to just we take things for granted, and people are allowed to go about their business.
We're very good at being ostriches with our heads.
Yeah. That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. This was A, going first, and B, just how much knowledge that you shared. So thanks.
And thanks for those great questions.
Thank you so much, Atta. I'm sorry if I mispronounced any of the names.
No, it's perfect.
You can correct me anytime. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. And the topic is representation of national and religious culture in EFL textbooks designed in Iran. Thank you for your presentation in advance, and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, just to remind you all that our presentation would be recorded. So if you wish to switch your camera off, go ahead, please. Thank you again.
All right. So I'll wait for another minute. We have a minute from now.
Sure.
Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Mojtaba, and today I will be presenting. It's an article that is being reviewed in the Journal of Critical Inquiries in Language Studies. So there's also there's a second author with this paper. So if I'm using the word we, so that means the second author and I am the first author of this. So the paper is being reviewed in a journal. Okay, so I'll be presenting today the representation of culture in EFL textbook design in Iran, a multimodal social semiotic approach. So first of all, what is our theoretical underpinning in this paper? So first of all, we look at culture and we draw on the definition of culture by Kromsch 2012 that defines culture as practices, perspective, values, and beliefs of the speakers of the language, which is represented in the language. This definition of culture is, they term this small c culture. And there's a good contrast with this definition of culture with the more traditional definition of culture, which was the big C culture, which defined culture as art and literature, especially classic art and literature. So we have terms such as French literature or British literature or English literature, that kind of definition of culture. So, but here, the definition of culture that we consider is the small c cultures that as I defined. With English as an international language, so the culture becomes the practices, perspective, values, and beliefs of native speakers of the language, but also all these practices and cultures and practices of the learners of English that communicate with English using English as a lingua franca. And then there is another aspect of theoretical underpinning in our work, which is global citizenship in education based on theories of Riesiger that focuses on solving global issues such as environment, pollution, migration, global pandemics such as COVID-19 that require the awareness and participation of people from different cultures and countries. So what is the connection here in second language education with culture and with global citizenship in education? So here, second and foreign language education is seen as an important way for raising global citizenship awareness in citizens of global world. So as Wagner and Biram 2017 they argue that foreign language education must draw upon theories of intercultural citizenship to ensure that learners can, in addition to learning active citizenship in their own country, they can acquire the knowledge and skills that are necessary to act in a community which is multicultural, international, and comprises more than one set of cultural values, beliefs, and perspectives. So, but our study, which is on language textbook, what is the connection to language textbooks? So language textbooks, in many contexts, they become curriculum artifacts that are used to socialize learners into second or foreign language cultures. And also they become the windows through which learners view the global culture and people of different countries and cultural backgrounds. And this is especially more important in language textbooks that are used in contexts where there is a more central system of education, where language textbooks are produced by the ministries of education centrally and then kind of imposed to different local educational institutions, and there's less freedom by these local institutions to design their own or use their own materials. So that becomes language textbook in such circumstances become more and more important. So what we did was using a multimodal social semiotic approach to analysis of culture in this language textbook. So what is it? Basically, there are two aspects that we use in our multimodal social semiotic approach. The first one is the concept of guided semiosis, which is the concept was put forward by Wenninger and Kiss for analysis of language textbooks. So I will just read through here with you that the authors have shown that the interconnection between text and image is an important discursive strategy that shapes potentials for meaning making in language textbooks. The authors argue that in a lot of circumstances, the interconnection of text and image fails to create semiotic affordances that allow learners to develop connotative meaning and reflexivity. So this approach is most common in language textbooks, is more useful in language textbook because textbooks are becoming more visual. They use different modes of presentation, most important of which is images. So if I show it through an example here, so you see a text here, which is its linguistic representation. So the readers of the text have an interpretation of that. So gravity will never be the same. But what is the interconnection between text and image? So as you can see here, when it is combined with images, the kind of meaning which is created in the readers is guided by the interconnection of text and image. As you can see, there is a totally different meaning is created by the interconnection of text and image, and that is the kind of meaning which is the readers are guided through this meaning, and the kind of and these are the kind of meanings that are intended by the producers of the text and image that are put in that frame. Okay, so the second notion that we use in our multimodal social semiotic approach was the concept of designed multimodal ensembles. So that is drawing on CREST 2010 that argues that the way a particular message is multimodally communicated is determined, among others, by the interest of the producers of the multimodal ensemble. So by multimodal ensemble, we mean the ensemble of different modes, such as text, image, color, the graphics. So these together become multimodal ensembles. So this is determined by the interest of the producers of the multimodal ensembles, as well as the interest of the receivers or the audience of the multimodal ensembles. And then both of these are reliant to how much power the audience or the producers bring to the communication while these multimodal messages are communicated between the producers and the receivers of the messages. So the CREST 2010 puts two ideas. So one will be, so that would be a continuum, but on one end of the continuum will be representationally apt multimodal ensembles, and on the other side of the continuum will be communicationally apt multimodal ensembles. In a representationally apt multimodal ensembles, there is more power and interests of the producers. They determine the kind of the way the messages are multimodally created and then communicated. But on the other hand, in the communicationally apt ensembles, the demand of the communication partner, the audience of the multimodal messages, they determine the way the multimodal messages are designed and then communicated to the audience. So if you consider language textbooks as a kind of communication between producers of textbooks and the audience, so producers will be the ministers of education, and then a group of authors, and then the audience will be the learners and the families. So that can be, the thing is the demand of the communication, which is important here. So, and the question is how much these are produced in a way that in what way the messages multimodally are produced, whether they are influenced by the power of the producers or the audience of the message. So the materials that we analyzed were 6 textbooks produced by Iranian Ministry of Education. We used quantitative data, and we look at these categories: images, and then textual representation, people's name, famous people, and then places. And as you can see here, the percentages of representation of Iranian culture was here in images, 80% of images, and then here in people's names and then famous people. So there is a lot of Iranian culture representation, but there is a lack of or absence or kind of underrepresentation of non-Iranian culture in the textbook that were produced. But we also used qualitative data. Our qualitative data consists of multimodal ensembles at 2 levels, at the introduction of the textbooks, so, and also at the multimodal learning activities. So what are the design multimodal ensembles in the introduction of the textbooks? You can see here an image of, this is an image that is represented in the introduction of all of the textbooks. So if you look at this multimodal ensemble, you can see the order of the language. So remember that this is a language textbook, English language textbook. If you look at the order of language, which language comes first, which language comes next, And then if you look at the size and the kind of graphic design which has been used, what is emphasized, what is overemphasized, what is underemphasized. So that kind of meaning is created, especially because that is in the introduction of the textbook. They have an important message for the content to be framed in the textbooks. So we will see more example of the design multimodal ensembles in the content of the textbooks. So this is a typical learning activity from the textbook. As you can see here, local names, and then local characters, and then references are made to local places here. So for example, the address has been, it's a reference to a local address inside the country. And here there is a kind of there's the idea of Verkilov put that idea of orientation to differences. So here there is a very low orientation to differences in terms of reference to global culture. And most of the references here, all of the references have been to the national and local culture. There's another example here I present from the multimodal learning activities. Again, you can see the same local characters with local names. And here there's an interesting use of the local feature of language. So here, so for example, teacher says, when is your birthday? And then says, it's in May. So that is September, but they use a local feature of the language and they kind of avoid using the global features of the language. So here will be, for example, September here. And then it can have a social effect here. So for example, at the end, teacher says, what about you? When is your birthday, Tahiri? And then it will be my birthday is in. So kind of the audience or the characters here in the textbook and the audience who are the students, they're kind of pushed toward or guided toward using the local features rather than the global aspects of the language. And this is an example throughout the textbook. We saw that there were more examples of such. So there were references to local food, local games, local places. So they use kind of local features in the language. Okay, so the study found that the representation of national and religious culture in a series of language textbooks designed by Iranian Ministry of Education prohibit the opportunity for language learners as global citizens to be exposed to cultural diversity. So there is an absence of global perspective in the textbooks. And this is a nationalism in language textbook. It has been addressed in other studies as well. So for example, in Romanian textbooks, the study of Kamasa 2009 found that there's a kind of second reality created by language textbook, which is very different from the kind of reality that learners experience in the real world, which is discursively created. More similar to this study was Ugandan language textbook, which is kind of similar to this study. There's an overrepresentation of local culture and an underrepresentation of global culture. So again, the study by Krams and Wilnal 2005 found that in Spanish language textbook, the same overrepresentation of Spanish culture is very dominant. And interestingly here, for the context of Canada, Gulliver 2011 also found that textbooks that are taught to immigrants in Canada, there's a kind of banal nationalism in these textbooks, in the sense that the Canadian culture is overrepresented and the immigrant experiences or stories are underrepresented or kind of absent from the textbooks. So, so in line with this studies, also the current study found that nationalism in language textbook is a very common one. All right, so with that note, we come to the end of the study. Thank you.
Thank you so
Wonderful. Alrighty, so yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So as I'm sure everyone kind of noticed from the schedule, today's presentation will be on shifting the gaze, so the importance of education in creating welcoming spaces for transgender individuals. So I'm Danielle, as I'm sure you can see by my Zoom name, and this is based on my thesis that was supervised by Shelley Russell Mayhew, and my mentors were Isabel Brun, Angela Lambert, and Jessica Saunders. So big shout out to them. So I always like to start with just some terms, just so we're on the same page. This might be a refresher for a lot of people. For some people, this might be new, but it helps just to go over it just in case. So transgender refers to a person whose gender identity does not match their assigned sex at birth. A cisgender person is someone whose gender identity aligns with or matches their assigned sex. And then with regards to kind of the focus of this presentation and my research, I took a look at what's called like a gaze or gazing behaviors. So these are kind of like our socialized perspectives, biases, assumptions, and so on, from which we kind of look at the world. So the lenses we kind of see the world through. The focus of my research was the male gaze. So this is the kind of like treatment of women as objects, as well as a systemic devaluation of women and femininity more generally, and how that kind of comes into play. So just as an example, within the context of like education, specifically in schools, this could be kind of how dress codes seem to favor girls. And a lot of it's kind of geared towards girls and what they should and shouldn't wear kind of thing. Another relevant gaze was the cisgender gaze. So again, this is the treatment of transgender people as objects. And then this like perceived entitlement of cisgender people to scrutinize, objectify, and judge transgender people. So that's kind of how I, as a cisgender person, I'm looking at, I'm understanding, and I'm interpreting the experiences of transgender people through my cisgender lens. So therefore I need to do a lot of reflection and critical thinking and that sort of thing to make sure that my assumptions don't get pushed on to their experiences in the research. And then as another example, there's the oppositional or white gaze. So this is a critique of the whiteness of media and the original kind of form of the male gaze. And this also kind of incorporates discrimination against people of color, devaluation of their experiences, and cultural appropriation. There's many, many other gazes. These are just kind of three. So just a little bit about the research project itself then. So the purpose of my thesis was to explore the experiences of transgender women with the male gaze, and kind of the intention, or I guess the rationale, was to understand the lived experiences of transmisogyny, which is transphobia and misogyny, and the experience of surveillance and judgment and policing of transgender women. So another kind of purpose here was to critique existing harmful social structures and kind of encourage a shift towards more empowerment, support, and kind of more generally self-expression. That's not limited to a very binary way of understanding gender and self-expression. So the method I used was interpretative phenomenological analysis, or IPA, which is a qualitative method. So this particular method uses semi-structured interviews. So there are some questions to guide the interviews, but it's very much left up to the participants as to what they want to discuss. And then these interviews are transcribed verbatim, they're coded. So anything that kind of sticks out in the interview or any observations from the interview, that's kind of what's involved in the coding. And then themes are kind of 10 minutes, perfect, thank you. Themes kind of emerge from the data then. So I did have 11 transgender women who participated in this study. So the framework I used was a critical feminist framework. So it's very kind of broad framework, but these are some of the main aspects of it. So there's the giving value to experiences, critique of social structures. That was a huge part of my research. And a lot of these social structures can kind of lead their way into different institutions like schools, education, that sort of thing. So that's why it's always kind of good to take a look at these structures. And there was an emphasis on intersectionality as well. So not just taking a look at the gender component, but any other identities that participants held that could be influencing their experiences. And the research has an ultimate goal of social change of some kind. So this is just a very brief summary of the findings because there was a lot and it would take a little while to kind of get through. So this is just a brief little summary. So one of the themes that emerged was the male gaze as being harmful and dehumanizing. So this could be like objectification, having to prove one's gender, that sort of thing. Another one was internalization of the male gaze. So sometimes the objectification and the devaluation of women and femininity, sometimes that would get turned inward and they would start policing themselves based on like these gendered expectations. Another one was male gaze as affirming. And this was quite a complex one. So participants mentioned that the male gaze or like this negative male attention is seen as kind of like part of the experience of being a woman. So when they received this negative male attention, it wasn't a positive experience, but it was affirming of their gender because it was like, oh, I'm being perceived as a woman because I'm receiving this male gaze kind of thing. And then the final one was the absence or rejection of the male gaze. So that could be for a number of reasons. Some participants were kind of actively protesting against this male gaze and discrimination and that kind of thing. And for some, they were so comfortable and almost euphoric in being able to live as their gender that the male gaze was essentially not even on their radar. So that was quite interesting. So now we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the implications for education specifically. I'll just go to the slide here. So kind of like what role does education play then in terms of like gazing behaviors and that sort of thing? So education does play a critical role in gazing and kind of creating welcoming spaces. And fortunately, gazing is kind of a behavior that's learned. So we learn it in multiple ways, in multiple forms. We can learn it from like our families, from media, from school, from our peers, that sort of thing. We can learn it from all over the place. And the other fortunate thing is that challenging these harmful systems and gazing behaviors is also something that we can learn. So it's not like all hope is lost kind of thing. So a key component of this change factor is kind of placing the responsibility on the person with more power in the dynamic. So just as an example, if it's like a student-teacher relationship, the teacher has more power in that relationship, and therefore the responsibility is on them to kind of teach these positive behaviors, model these behaviors, that kind of thing. So yeah, it could be like modeling respectful behaviors, making a statement or a stance against like discrimination or kind of like gender typing behaviors or ideas like careers, that sort of thing. So one kind of example that sort of comes up a lot here is if a girl is being harassed by a boy, 5 minutes, thanks. By like, this is a common example, unfortunately, but if he's like pulling out her bra straps and then she kind of shoves him away because it's getting quite frustrating. The person who has more power in that dynamic is the boy. And so the responsibility is on him to change his behaviors. And so educators, teachers, leaders, whomever, they kind of need to make that clear. And so that could be like modeling, acknowledging one's privilege. It could be modeling taking accountability or responsibility and apologizing when necessary, kind of thing. So those are some of the ways that can come up. And the next one, I'm sure this is one that we've kind of all heard of a lot, especially as it's gaining traction. But kind of this acknowledging one's own privilege and gazing behaviors. So that can be in a ton of different ways. It can be like just educating yourself through reading, watching videos, engaging in materials, learning from others, that sort of thing. And so we kind of want to model this reflection for students as well, or whoever we're kind of in a relationship or system with. So we don't want to kind of further like a power gap, whether it be with students or whomever. So we want to make sure that we're attentive to any isms or oppressive behaviors or that kind of thing. So that's always important. So then kind of with regards to this kind of consistently creating and promoting like open and safe spaces, there's like a few things that we can kind of do for that. We want to make students and those we're working with to kind of feel like they're able to make and learn from mistakes and not have that be a source of like shame. We want others to feel like safe being themselves and know that they have you who will advocate and support them, kind of thing. That's a really important sort of role. That can be done in many, many forms. It could be using proper pronouns, allowing people of all genders to kind of wear what they want, shifting away from gender typing like games or activities or careers, that kind of thing, and really make it clear that you will like denounce and not tolerate oppression or harassment or any other harmful behaviors. So everyone's clear that you're creating this environment and that you're going to stand for that kind of environment. And then kind of just like supporting students or whomever you're kind of working with and living as their true selves, making sure that you prove to them that you're a trustworthy and safe person. It's not so much about them putting in the work to trust people more. It's about us kind of showing that we are able to be trusted, kind of thing. So that's a really important part, and it can be a little complex in that way, but yeah, it's about kind of showing that we can be safe people, that we can be trustworthy people. Yeah, so it's I'll just leave everyone kind of with a final thought here, but you know, as educators or future educators or leaders or whomever, we have such a unique and wonderful role of kind of being a source of support and safety for so many people. And so we really want to take on that role as much as we can and really show people that we can be a safe space for them. So yeah, that's it. And I noticed I had 1 minute left, so I'm right on time. Yeah, so thank you for being here, and absolutely, if you have any questions, you can ask it now, or else I put my email there if you want to check in or follow up later.
I'll start out with talking about the preliminary analysis I did when I was thinking about starting to write my dissertation proposal. So I'll start out with kind of talking about what analysis I did and my findings from that. And then I'll talk about where I'm thinking about going now with my dissertation. And I would love to get your impressions or comments or feedback or anything like that. So my project focuses on housing segregation at the school district level in the US. And there's a good body of literature on school segregation, so between different schools. There's less literature on it at the district level, and there's very little literature on the overlap between housing segregation and school districts. So what we do know, though, is that housing segregation has a negative impact on disadvantaged students by concentrating them into school districts. And we know that school districts that have higher concentrations of students living in poverty have worse academic and actually health outcomes for low-income students. And there is some research to suggest that this kind of segregation allows wealthier school districts to hoard funding resources for their own students' advantage. So in general, in the literature, there are kind of three components that make up segregation between school districts. The first is what we call school district gerrymandering, which is when the lines of a school district are drawn in order to exclude or include certain groups of students. The second would be component of segregation is the structure of funding that we have in many states in the US. This is a huge topic with lots of complexity, but in general, between kind of 20 and 40% of a school district's funding comes from local property taxes. And this incentivizes school districts to exclude low-income students to keep their per pupil funding high. And then the third component is housing segregation, and this is what this project is focused on. So the research questions that I kind of set out to do this initial investigation before I started writing my proposal, I wanted to understand the extent to which US states are segregated between school districts for children aged 5 to 17 living in poverty and those not living in poverty. This age group was chosen because it matches with the primary and secondary school age children. The second question I wanted to understand was the relationship between segregation and poverty prevalence. And then the extent to which this relationship varied by region. So in the US, the size and shape of school districts tend to vary by region. So the Northeast and the Midwest tend to have small fragmented school districts, whereas West and South school districts tend to be larger and fragmented due to the lower levels of infrastructure development and housing density in these areas. So all the data for this analysis comes from the 2018 US Census Small Area Income Poverty Estimates. And this is a program that measures the number of children in each school district in the United States, of which there are about 7,000 unified school districts that I used in my analysis, excluding Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia. And this program measures the number of students living in poverty and not living in poverty, ages 5 to 17, measured by their participation in their state's free or reduced price lunch program, which is a program to give free or reduced price lunches to students who are below or at or within kind of 20% of the state's poverty line. I measured segregation for this project using the dissimilarity index. Thank you. And this measures the extent to which groups are separated evenly across a geographical area. The relationship between poverty, prevalence, and segregation was analyzed using a simple linear regression analysis. So my findings, I've mapped my findings so that they're easier to see. So this map shows the extent to which states have the percent of children living in poverty in each state. The lighter areas show less poverty and the darker areas show greater poverty. This map is not necessarily super helpful by itself, but the next map shows the level of segregation, the lighter areas being less segregated, the darker areas being more segregated. So this is the level of segregation per state between school districts. So when we put them side by side, this is kind of where my analysis comes in. So we can see that there are some states that have high prevalence of poverty, but they have low segregation between school districts. So an example would be a state like Louisiana, has relatively high prevalence of students living in poverty, but very relatively even distribution of those students across school districts. In comparison to a state like New Jersey, where we can see New Jersey has very low levels of child poverty, but very high levels of segregation. So when plotted against one another, at first it doesn't necessarily, even with log plotting, where Y shows the percent of children in poverty, X shows the segregation level, until we disaggregate them by region. And this is what I was kind of interested in, was what's the regional variation in this relationship between poverty prevalence and segregation? So what we can see is that these yellow dots, which are states in the South, we can see that they have, some of them have the highest prevalence of poverty, but relatively moderate compared to all the other states' level of segregation. In comparison to states in the Northeast and states in the Midwest, in which they have relatively low, less than 20% of their students live in poverty, but some of these states have the highest levels of segregation. When analyzed with the regression trend line, we can see that there's the strongest relationship is positive relationship is for the Midwest. So we can see there's a positive relationship between percent of children who are living in poverty and the level of segregation. And there's a positive but less strong relationship for students in the Northeast, in states in the Northeast. The South and West, we would say there is no relationship between the prevalence of poverty and segregation at the state level, which makes sense if we think about the fact that these states tend to have school districts that are pretty big, and therefore the segregation between these school districts is largely intra. So it's largely between schools within school districts. So these findings kind of made me think, especially the findings for the Midwest and the Northeast, made me think about not just what's the negative impact on low-income students, but who might benefit from having their state be segregated between school districts on the basis of family income. And then thinking about, is family income sufficient to understand the relationship between housing segregation and school district segregation? So there's a big literature on different components of class and sociology, and usually it's measured as a combination of income, occupational prestige, and educational attainment. And so this led me kind of down the role of thinking, what is the role that parental education attainment plays? So college educated parents, like, do they have an additional incentive to get their children into better school districts with higher per pupil funding than parents who don't need this to achieve their class reproduction? So this is kind of where I'm thinking now, and this is the proposal. Thank you. This is the proposal that I'm writing now. So I'm thinking about the way that professional managerial class people, so people like us who have college educations, in order to reproduce themselves in the next generation, their children have to go to college. And what incentives does this create for segregation? So thinking about what is the benefit to excluding students who don't come from college educated families from districts in terms of social networks, in terms of social capital, in terms of supporting kind of education funding, and how this might be driven by the competitiveness of university admissions and drive educational achievement gaps between children who have parents who are college educated and those who don't. So my questions are basically thinking about, we all know that very wealthy people benefit from segregating their children even into another tier of education in private schools. In the US compared to Quebec, we have much less private education. only about 10% of American students go to private schools, which is very low for OECD countries. So if the vast majority of educated professionals are going to send their children to public schools, how might they benefit from segregation? So the research question I'm thinking about now for my moving forward for my dissertation proposal is looking at to what extent housing is segregated between schools, not only by income, but perhaps parental educational attainment. And what I'd like to see is if this is perhaps a more salient way to understand the choices that people make about where they live in relation to segregation, and how that might both be related to income segregation, but be a very salient factor that drives school district segregation more broadly today in the 21st century. So I would love to get anyone's feedback. This is kind of the end of my presentation. So if anyone has any kind of questions or comments or suggestions, things from a different perspective, perhaps, I would love that. Okay, I see I have one in the chat. Oh, thank you.